You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Welcome to First Contact, a podcast all about Star Trek The Next Generation. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
This week we have been watching The Enemy. It was written by David Kemper and Michael Piller and directed by David Carson. It first aired the week of November 6, 1989. James, what's this one all about?
An away team comprising the first officer, head of security and chief engineer beam down to an inhospitable planet close to the neutral zone to investigate a Romulan distress signal. With poor visibility and heavy interference, they can barely see in front of their faces. But they don't operate the buddy system, and Geordi wanders off on his own and falls down a hole. Meanwhile, Worf and Riker find a badly injured Romulan survivor and take him to the ship. And would you believe it, a big Romulan ship is on its way to cause a diplomatic incident. Crusher finds a way to treat him, but the only transplant option is Worf, and he refuses to help due to the whole Romulans killing his family thing. On the surface, Geordi is held captive by another Romulan, but ultimately they decide to work together to survive. Everything works out fine in the end, but it almost didn't.
Alex, you've never seen this episode before. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was a very good episode overall, with the caveat that there is a B-plot in it that is odd and really goes nowhere, to be honest.
I have to disagree with you there. Maybe we shouldn't jump to this straight at the start of the podcast, but I don't think a society should force somebody to do what they're asking of Worf.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. This is a good teaser. I really like this because we are straight into the action. We're on Planet Hell, but it's a really well-dressed Planet Hell. It's really well lit. Planet Hell looks good in the dark. You know, you can do alien planets there. Nobody can see anything. Geordi can see some things. It's quite dynamic. I think it's probably one of the better starts of any of the episodes we've had. It's not just faffing around or some kind of joke or anything like that.
Yeah, no, the Planet Hell set looking particularly good this time round. I think so much so that you wouldn't know it was the Planet Hell set unless someone said to you in advance. Part of the reason for that, I think, being that previously when we've seen the Planet Hell set, quite often it's very overlit and it shows every imperfection of that set, whereas this time there's a lot of use of shadows, low lighting. It's very well dressed in terms of dressing it as that cave, and it doesn't look like it's ever previously looked. It looks like an entirely different set. It's one of the best guest sets that the series has had so far, I'd say.
And it's great that we didn't open with 5 minutes of them all on the bridge talking about how they've got faint Romulan distress signals, but oh, the planet's in the neutral zone. They just cut all that nonsense out and just jumped straight to them beaming down and reaching the incident itself.
And in fact, that teaser very much like modern television, really, rather than what we've seen previously with TNG. Not to make it sound like TNG was a thing of distant memory, but it was quite some time ago now. We're talking over 20 years, and the language of television has changed somewhat. Pre-credits teasers are often faster and get to the action a lot quicker than TNG often does. But this seemed to fit that mould a lot more. As you say, James, it cuts straight to the point. It's quite refreshing, actually, to see that happen.
It's good, and it gives David Carson a chance to show, some interesting directions, some different camera angles. A lot of the early stuff was very flat. It was just wide shot, mid shot, close up, and this has a lot more movement in it, and torches, something that would go on to be a staple of genre television with the X-Files. They really showed they got in early with those. What do you make of that away team? Now, I know it's the show, and it shouldn't bother me by this point, but it's 3 of the most important people in the ship going down to this very dangerous planet. Why is Geordi even there? Why do they need the chief engineer on this? I know it's potentially Romulan technology, but it just seems like that's not the ideal team for this job.
Picard didn't want to get his shoes muddy.
That's fine. I mean, that's generally all I needed. And of course, they go and investigate. They all split up, like in a classic horror movie, don't they? And Geordie wanders off because, of course, that's exactly what you would do. And he falls down a hole.
And at that point, we all go, "Oh, it's a Geordie episode this week." After the last one, and we all know how that went.
Given that they do change the order of the episodes around quite a lot, it does seem quite strange that there's 2 Geordie episodes in a row, because I would argue throughout TNG's run, there aren't really that many Geordie episodes, and to have 2 right beside each other here seems very odd. Even from a placement point of view, you'd think they would split them up a little bit, maybe break it up with a Troy romantic episode, say.
We will get there.
There's a lot going on in this episode, but I don't think any one of the elements actually is the primary driving narrative. They're all very much connected. There's the Romulan diplomatic incident, potentially a new war with the Federation. You have Worf refusing to give his blood donation, essentially, to save the Romulan on the ship, and Geordie having to gain the trust of Centurion Bokra down on the planet and work together with them to try and get off the planet. I'm not sure which one of those is actually the main plot. It feels like it's probably the Geordie one, but I would say the time's actually split quite evenly between all those elements.
I kind of think of the Geordie plot as being the A plot. I don't think of the Picard one as being a B plot as such, because it's so intrinsically linked to the Geordie plot. I just kind of see them as 2 sides of the same coin. And I kind of see Worf as not wanting to give the blood donation as a very loose tangential B plot that really does go nowhere. I mean, it comes to a shuddering halt, and there's no consequences of such. I mean, I can see that when the episode's been written and when it's been produced, and there's probably people who would argue, no, Worf's decision does have consequences, and it does, but no one learns from it, which is a really odd thing to happen. There's a consequence and then nothing more of it.
I disagree completely with you, Alex, because I think this is TNG finally starting to show a bit of nuance in its characters. I think they've all been Boy Scouts up to this point, and they'll always do the right thing because that's what Starfleet does, but they're able to get outside of Gene Roddenberry's box a bit here by dealing with Klingon culture and Romulan culture, and Worf's actually given a moral quandary, and essentially he fails that test. And I know overall there aren't big consequences, but I think that's quite an interesting decision for one of our characters to make, essentially not doing the right thing straight away, and in the end not doing the right thing at all. And that's certainly a lot more interesting than saying we don't have grief in the 24th century. I don't even know how it slipped past Gene Roddenberry.
I don't actually disagree with you. I think you're right. It's a side issue that I have problems with. Basically, everything up until the point that the Romulan dies, I think is fine. It's not what I expect. And actually, when I say it's a bizarre side plot, I don't mean that what they're addressing is bizarre. It's what happens after he dies that I find odd, because the whole issue of Worf not wanting to give blood, essentially, and the reasons behind it, it is kind of interesting, and they are getting into character details, and that is good. That is good to see. It's just the fact that you have the character has died, and I don't want people sort of standing around moping about it, but it's brushed aside in moments. At the minute that they find there's another Romulan, it's just never addressed again. And it just feels like there's a plot thread that's been going along and nothing happens. I don't want Worf to have a sudden change of heart, but it feels like there's a missing scene somewhere.
I can understand it from that point of view, because you've talked about the language of television already, and I think in terms of TNG, you do have to wrap it all in a neat bow at the end, and everyone continues on their way. And having that other Romulan on the planet is like, well, as long as we've got one, there won't be a diplomatic incident. So it's probably a bit too neat in its resolution, but I'm glad it's there, and I think we learned something about Worf, certainly about his past and his parents as well, which I'm not sure we really knew explicitly before.
I mean, I'm happy with the way the Worf storyline came to a close, because it didn't feel like the easy ending which we would get in season 1. And of course, in season 1, as well as Riker, Crusher, and Picard badgering Worf and trying to get him to give blood, we would have Troy with her psychobabble, trying to teach him the error of his ways and telling him that she senses great emotion. And then we'd have Data learning about prejudice this week in his quest to become more human.
I find, in some ways, it more interesting for the picture that it paints of Picard than the picture it paints of Worf. And it's perhaps one of the few moments we've seen so far where that old Trek line from the original series, or the film specifically, of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, where that's actually being questioned. And that's good. That's what it should be doing. If it has these big grandiose ideas, it should absolutely be questioning it. And that's the thing that I think is interesting. And the way that the Picard essentially tries to manipulate the situation at times.
So going into this episode, I had absolutely no memory of the Worf storyline, and I was really taken aback by it. I didn't expect a storyline like this so soon in Next Generation. I was surprised, and pleasantly surprised, that they've done an episode in which they've not only tackled a difficult subject, but you don't come out of it thinking of Worf as the bad guy. You understand his position, even if it has meant somebody has died. You don't think, oh, that's just nasty old Worf. You think, I respect his views. Even if I disagree, I do think Worf should have given blood. But I respect his right not to.
To try and draw an odd parallel, and it's perhaps one we draw too often and people will be annoyed, but I don't really care, it's been 4 months. I would sort of relate it back to my feelings on some of Doctor Who, in the way that quite often that sort of idea of the many outweighing the few, you rarely see that played through to its logical conclusion. And part of the reason for that will obviously be that, you know, it's a family show, it's aimed at a younger audience. But aside from that, it's fundamentally a depressing thing to see, because the consequences of that philosophy, while it may be, you know, entirely justifiable on many occasions, can also be quite horrific. And that's why with that particular show you will often see them sort of stating the case for that, but then trying to find any workaround that is possible to avoid having to make either choice. Now, for some people, that's a frustrating element, which was what a lot of people's complaint with the 50th anniversary special was. I think they're wrong. I think they are entirely wrong, and it's a totally stupid argument, but that's by the by. The fact is, the other solution was far more interesting and far more satisfying. And that's kind of what they're doing here, but I don't know, it feels like it gets lost. What we don't want is for return our man. I'm afraid he died. Oh. Well, you'll have to die then. I suppose so, and it's a shame we didn't find another person down there. You know, and then everything crashes to a halt. Obviously, that would be awful. Or, you know, some sort of mawkish Series 1 vibe where Worf realises the error of his ways and takes a knife and starts slashing his arm to get as much blood out as possible. Neither of these solutions are pleasing. So I can see why they've gone for what they've gone for. But, I don't know, it feels like it's nearly there and it just misses a little bit, which is a shame because everything that's preceded it has been quite good, and that applies to the Geordie plot as well, which I think is very good.
Yeah, let's get onto that a little bit. And so he's down in the hole, and he sees some really conveniently placed bits of metal just sitting there in the mud, and he turns the phaser setting to melt metal and then reharden mode, and that works well, and he makes a little pickaxe. See, when he was digging around in that clay, is what it looks like. I really thought he was going to make a full head of Lionel Richie.
This is how I see you.
So yeah, he fashions a tool because he's a resourceful guy, and he climbs out of the hole and then just wanders around slightly blindly. Now, was anybody surprised when that second Romulan appeared?
No.
No, because I've seen the episode before.
That's true. Like, it's been a while, but I was still nicely, ooh, there's another Romulan, and then he hits Geordie and tries to take him hostage. Do you feel you learn a lot about the Romulan people in this episode? Obviously, they're trying to build them back up as an enemy, as they've been trying to do since their reintroduction, but it's all a bit generic bad guy, a little bit arch and secretive, which I suppose is their defining trait in some ways.
No, that's exactly the description I was going to say. It's always that same sort of thing, isn't it? And that's why it's refreshing when you get some sort of villain that doesn't do that. That whole thing of, no, there's no one else there. Oh, surprise! There's a guy. And we will tell you nothing, and we will invade the neutral zone, and if you don't do this, we'll blow you out the sky. It's nothing new. Forgetting the Romulan on the planet, the whole thing with Picard and the Romulan captain, that's a side issue, really. And that's the one where that suffers the most. But it's essentially just the ticking clock. It's nothing else, really. Although the episode weirdly has a dual ticking clock, because on one hand you got that, on the other hand you've also got, if it carries on much longer, Geordie will be blinder.
Not only does the planet have a really weird atmosphere, which means there's a very limited window where you can transport, I guess, electrical storms, but it also degenerates neural tissue. All these elements act as a catalyst, essentially, for them to work together. It's necessary, but it doesn't feel too forced, to be honest. I think the work they've done in making this planet look so good and so hostile actually plays pretty nicely into that as a motivator.
It's just the ticking clock. It's the thing that happens. It's a way of getting those two characters to talk to each other, just putting them in a difficult position. It's something you'll see across the board. It's something you'll see in Red Dwarf, Rimmer and Lister being marooned on a planet because their ships crashed. To pick a sci-fi TV series recently, Star Wars Rebels has had much the same. In fact, it's had a very similar episode recently where an Imperial has been trapped down a hole with a rebel, and they're forced to help each other survive. It's just the thing to put them together. It's just that it's stepped it up a little bit further by giving them a time limit. And in those sort of situations, you always have to have some kind of time limit. They'll die, they'll starve, they'll freeze.
There are much better versions of this in future Next Generation episodes, actually. There's an episode called Darmok, which is along similar lines, which is excellent.
There's just so many obstacles thrown into this episode, and I guess it's because that plot is so simple. There's not a lot really to it. It's a guy trapped on a planet with another guy who doesn't like him, and it's padded out in some ways, and I don't say that in a bad way. It's, stretched out in quite a decent science fiction way. They can't communicate with the ship. That's good. They can't use their equipment. That's good. They're getting more and more injured. That's kind of interesting. Wesley Crusher, who has been fairly quiet of late, comes up with his boy genius solution to put a neutrino beam down, which only Geordie can see. And then, again, the obstacle, Geordie can't necessarily see that, because his vision's failing. It all adds to the drama, and it might be quite mechanical in the way that it does that, but it's an effectively told story. I don't want to analyse it too much, because when you're watching it, it all works very well.
I feel it treads the line very carefully, because the danger that you always run into with those sort of episodes is playing too much on the initial "I'll tell you nothing" type idea. And it does tread the line a little bit early on with constant situations where the Romulan just points the gun at Geordie again. But each of those plot points, because it always goes through a certain development, you've got that initial hostility, getting to know each other, and then resolution, they help each other. And it's just making sure each of those 3 sections never outstays its welcome. And I feel it just stays within just. And probably part of what helps it is exactly what you say there, that it's got these other elements that it can keep cutting to. The fact that it can keep cutting to the Enterprise greatly helps the fact, because there's not a great deal to the Romulan character, let's be honest. It's sort of fairly one note. The whole thing that they have to discuss there is, hey, this species that you thought was irredeemable, turns out maybe they're not so bad. That's it, really.
And is Georgie even the best character they could have done this episode with? I suppose there is an element of they did it because he's blind, and then they can add another element in on that.
Well, no, the character that it would make sense to do it with is Worf. Logically, if you were writing it, you would put Worf in the hole. Without wishing to pun it, there's bad blood between them. But then they try to have their cake and eat it by not using Worf, but using him in a separate plot. But then, again, maybe that's to the betterment of the episode. It doesn't go down the immediately obvious route, and yet it still has that element, but it plays it out in a different way, and it has that manipulation element from Picard that we all liked, that we all enjoyed seeing. And if Worf was down in the hole, we wouldn't have exactly the same plot. I feel that it's not designed to work the way that it does. It's happenstance, but ultimately it comes off.
I feel like the ending definitely wouldn't have worked if it was Worf. You can't have Worf and Romulan becoming friends at the end of the episode and they're working together. That just... I don't feel that is in the scope of Worf's character.
No, well, that would have been much more of a sort of season 1 ending, and I think if you were going to do that in this season, you would have to fundamentally change the ending. There'd have to be some sort of thing that you think they're working together, but it turns out something's amiss, and all this time that Worf hasn't trusted, or something along those lines. So, as I say, perhaps it's fortuitous that they didn't use Worf. It's the obvious one to go with, but perhaps in doing it, they avoided cliche.
Do they really become friends, though? 'Cause, I mean, the only reason they really work together is because polystyrene rocks fall on the Romulan's head. If that event hadn't happened, would he have just shot Geordie? I mean, he's quite annoying. He's back to sort of season 1 quippy Geordie with his sand in his shoes.
I never lie when I have sand in my shoes, Commodore.
What's that even mean? Is that funny? Is there a punchline there that I'm missing?
I don't know, and ironically, with you talking about Lionel Richie earlier, every time I kept hearing the word Commodore, all I could think of was the Commodores.
Originally, this episode was supposed to be Geordie and Troy on the planet with the Romulan. Thankfully, they didn't go down that route, because it probably would have been worse.
Again, why would Troy be on that away mission?
So she can sense the Romulans?
So they can leave her there. And would she wear the cat suit on the away mission? Or would she put on some kind of different uniform? I mean, I'm just not sure of the formalities of this.
Just put on a jacket. Anything.
They don't have jackets in the Next Generation. It's very strange. I think every character, except maybe Data, has something to do in this episode. I mean, Riker is incredibly angry at everyone and shouting, "Solutions, everyone! I've lost Geordie. That was my fault. I shouldn't have let him off his leash in his first place." It's an odd performance from Frakes, I feel, but maybe he's just being forceful.
Yeah, no, I'd go with that. I would also say that I did get to the end of it, and I thought that Brent Spiner had been surprisingly absent throughout the episode. Not quite as much as Miles O'Brien, however. who, when his voice came on the communicator at the end, I thought, oh yeah, bloody hell, he's in this. God, it's amazing that he flew out there, really.
In the end, it all works out. They get back to the ship. The other Romulan dies. Worf doesn't have to make any difficult decisions, even though he has lots of conversations about it. And I guess, despite the Romulans crossing through the neutral zone, all is well in the world? Or do you think this is sort of building up to something else? Do you think the balance of power or the balance of terror has changed a bit with the Romulans?
No, it kind of feels the same. It kind of feels like a standard ending in a way, with Picard getting the intellectual one-up, but not a defeat of them as such, which is sort of very, very typical way to finish things. But it's fine. It's a little bit of a hackneyed ending to have the Commodore say, no, I've been treated well. In fact, this man saved my life. You know, we aren't that different, you and I. It's just short of cutting to a song and dance number. But the goodwill that the rest of the episode has generated carries it through. It's fine. I'm not going to begrudge it the ending that it has. I might begrudge it the resolution to Worf's plot, but the overall weight of the good largely outweighs any problems the episode has.
I think they're still at a point at which they can't have an ending which isn't the nice ending. Because there were ways in which you could have ended this episode with the Romulans and the Federation having increased aggressions because the Romulan was killed and the Romulans blamed the Federation. But they just went for the nice ending that, oh, the Federation are actually okay. And that's it.
It's a good-looking episode, and it's fun enough, but it's not one that's going to linger on my mind, especially. But it's of a more consistent quality, and that's what we've been crying out for quite some time.
I think you can cut them a little bit of slack, because they're finally picking up the Romulan strand from the end of Season 1. And they still haven't fully realised how to make the Romulans work in Next Generation, in the same way that they haven't quite worked out how to make the Ferengi work. At this time, all they think of the Romulans as is, oh, they're a bit cunning and they lie a lot. And that's very one-dimensional, and that's the way they're portrayed here. It's very much like the way that the Klingons were one-dimensional, in that they were just a bit angry all the time. Things get better. The seeds of the good Romulans, as in the Romulans that aren't one-dimensional, are here. And we see them more, particularly in Deep Space Nine.
On that note, let's sweep up some of the mud Geordi left on the floor and throw it against the wall in the place we call Quickfire.
Quickfire.
Turning to Star Trek The Next Generation 365, the book has a quote from Michael Okoda talking about how the Planet Hell set was constructed over the top of an old swimming pool, stating, years before TNG, the area was featured as a cavern on the surface of the moon for the miniseries Space. The book goes on to state, perhaps that's why the crew found so little breathable air in there. Ah, those guys.
The early scene with Crusher in sickbay, she says of the Romulan, there's no obvious cranial trauma, except that giant bleeding wound on his head and the fact that Worf punched him in the middle of the face. I don't think she's a real doctor.
Green blood. That is such a cliche for when you want an odd-looking alien. Oh, they're not like us. They bleed green, you know.
Is that because the Vulcans bleed green as well?
Yes, the Vulcans do bleed green, which shows they're related. But not as much related as we thought, really.
So turning to that perennial favourite, the Nitpicker's Guide for Next Generation Trekkers, we're looking to see what this episode has done wrong for the most ardent of arseholes to pick up on and complain about. But the book states, This episode stumped the nitpicker. I couldn't find anything wrong with it. Kudos to the creators.
Despite the fact that I've already pointed out that when we see Geordie's vision, it's different to the previous episodes. To the point at which, if it were a sitcom, we'd have a comedy moment every week where Geordie sees in a different way. One week everything's monochrome, one week everybody's naked, and one week everything is a Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
For God's sake, keep that information to yourself, or Phil Farrand will write another bloody volume.
There is a substance in my cells which you need to survive. Rejected lines from the Star Trek porn parody.
It's a neutrino Geiger counter. Thank you, Geordie, for explaining things in terms that we understand, but you don't. This is the first episode directed by David Carson. He would go on to direct many more TNG and Deep Space Nine, and the film Generations. We're all looking forward to that.
The debut version of the palm beacons required a sometimes visible cable that ran inside the actor's sleeves to an off-camera power source. Anyone notice that?
No. Also, torches as a technology exist now. Was it that hard to get batteries into that unit? Another rejected line from the Star Trek porn parody. Well, that wraps up another episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, and indeed First Contact. We will be back again very soon with the Troy-heavy episode, The Price. But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. I'm blind! Another rejected line from the Star Trek porn parody.
Welcome to Golondon Core, where no good deed goes unpunished. Another rejected line from the Star Trek porn parody.
For what it's worth, I understand your bitterness. More rejected lines from the Star Trek porn parody.